The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine was established on the 24th of September 1991. 1 month after Ukraine's declaration of independence resolution, the ministry was put in charge of all Soviet military forces reorganization on the territory of Ukrainian jurisdiction. The President of Ukraine is the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Since the 4th of March 2020, Andriy Taran is Ukraine's defense minister. In 1994, Ukraine voluntarily gave up all nuclear weapons. The ministry spent significant funds eliminating former nuclear powers, military bases and manpower equipment to meet Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe requirements. As ratified by the Verkhovna Rada, the major objectives of the ministry are preventing hostility, structuring the military, and repelling all types of aggression. Ukrainian security policies are based on non-intervention, respect for the national borders and sovereignty of other states, rejecting any use of force as an instrument of influence. Because of political sensitivity, the military doctrine, similar to Ukraine's security policy, does not point out a specific threats. It rather refers to a states whose consistent policy presents a military threat, or leads to interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine, or encroaches Ukraine's territorial integrity and national interests. Hence, the Ministry of Defense is responsible for. The first military executive office was created on June 28, 1917 as part of the General Secretariat of Ukraine and was headed by Simon Petliura. It was created based on the Ukrainian General Military Committee under auspices of the Central Council of Ukraine. The Russian Provisional Government refused to recognize it, but after the October Revolution the Secretariat of Military Affairs was re-established on November 12, 1917. At the end of December 1917, Simon Petliura resigned in protest to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. At the same time, Bolsheviks established own executive branch as part of the People's Secretariat headed by Vasyl Shukry. On January 6, 1918, Volodymyr Vinichenko appointed Mykola Porsh to the vacant position. On January 25, 1918, the General Secretariats were reorganized into People's Ministries as Ukraine proclaimed its independence. Ministry of Military Affairs existed also during the regime of Hetman of Ukraine Pavlo Skoropadsky, and until the exile of the Ukrainian national government at the end of 1920. On January 24, 1919, there was established the People's Commissariat of Military Affairs of the Ukrainian SSR. In summer of 1919 it was dissolved due to the military union that was signed between governments of the Ukrainian SSR and the Russian SFSR in April 1919. In 1944 there also existed the People's Commissariat of Defense of the Ukrainian SSR. In 1991, Ukraine inherited one of the largest military forces not only in the post-communist area, but in all of Europe. This included 780,000 formerly Soviet military personnel, 1 rocket army, 4 Air Force armies, a separate air defense army, and the Black Sea Fleet. Altogether, when established, the armed forces of Ukraine included more than 350 ships, 1,500 combat aircraft, and 1,272 strategic nuclear warheads of intercontinental ballistic missiles. This force was designed to confront NATO in full-scale warfare, using conventional and nuclear weapons. On the 24th of September 1991, Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted the resolution about the process of taking under its jurisdiction of all military units of former Soviet armed forces situated on the territory of Ukraine, and about the establishment of one of the Ministry of Defense. Hence, the country became the first among the former Soviet republics to establish a Ministry of Defense. The ministry and the Ukrainian government subsequently began establishing the different military branches of Ukraine. The political preference of Ukraine authority on the non-nuclear and non-coalition state status was made to be the foundation of the armed forces organization process, but equally as important to the foundation were the limitations connected with approval of the Agreement on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, and implementation of the Tashkent Agreement of 1992. which established not only maximal levels of arms for each state of former USSR. Therefore, between 1992 and 1997 the number of military personnel in Ukraine was nearly halved. In a short span of time, Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine passed some legislative acts concerning the military sphere. The Conception for Defense and Organization of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The Resolution on Security Council of Ukraine. Laws of Ukraine on Defense of Ukraine. On the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And Military Doctrine of Ukraine, mostly related to structural control of the armed forces. In addition, Ukraine began its nuclear weapons disarmament program in the early 90s. By the 1st of June 1996, there was no nuclear weapon in Ukraine. During the first few years of independence, the national